Men in black are reported everywhere across the world. In fact, these men may not even be human. Their enigma is just that great. Whether government agents, ultradimensional entities, or aliens, it is claimed they exist for one purpose: to silence all those involved in UFO research and make sure that the truth about the existence of extraterrestrials and their agenda remains obscured. It was the 3rd of August 1965, and 38-year-old former police officer Rex Heflin was out on the Santa Ana Freeway in Southern California doing his job as a highway maintenance engineer for the Orange County Road Department. Several trees were obscuring a railroad crossing sign, and, concerned that motorists would be unaware of the danger ahead, Heflin attempted to radio in and alert his supervisor. The radio, however, was unexpectedly dead. At that moment, sitting inside his work van trying to make contact, Heflin is said to have spotted something strange in the sky. A 20-foot wide, hat-shaped aircraft that flew across the road at a height of about 150 feet. Fortunately, Heflin had a Polaroid camera to hand, which he used for his job, and was able to photograph the peculiar craft through the windscreen of his van. As it came closer, he claimed he witnessed a greenish-white rotating beam of light emitting from the center of the UFO on the bottom side, and was able to take 2 further photos. Watching the craft through the passenger window of his van, Heflin described seeing it wobble as it continued moving away, slowly gaining altitude, at which point it seemed to gain stability, then it increased its velocity and altitude more rapidly, leaving a deposit of smoke-like vapor, after which it disappeared, a bluish-black ring of smoke in its wake. Heflin then drove towards the smoke ring and was able to take a 4th and final photograph before the smoke faded. At the time, Heflin believed he had seen an experimental aircraft from the nearby El Toro Marine Base. As such, he did not think much about the images and didn't mention the incident to anyone until he showed the photos to a few co-workers at his Santa Ana office. Upon sharing them, it was suggested that what he had seen was not an experimental aircraft and might in fact be something more unusual, perhaps even something not from Earth. Heflin was unconvinced and for a time kept the images to himself. Eventually, after loaning the originals to his sister, copies of Heflin's photos ended up being displayed in a pharmacy in Santa Ana, at which point the publisher and co-owner of the Santa Ana Register newspaper saw them and asked to borrow the originals for publication. Reluctant and still believing the photographs to be of an experimental aircraft from El Toro, Heflin eventually agreed for the newspaper to make copies of the images. 6 weeks after the initial incident, the photographs were published in the Register. Soon after, the story attracted the attention of UFO researchers, who, far from agreeing with Heflin's assumption that the object in question was an experimental aircraft, believed he had actually witnessed a craft of extraterrestrial origin. What is more, upon being asked, the El Toro Marine Base denied that the object in the photos was an experimental craft. It was not from their base, and they had received no other reports relating to the object. Eager to examine the case in greater detail, researchers contacted Heflin asking to see the original Polaroids. The answer they received was unexpected. Heflin explained that they could not borrow them, as a government official had already taken them away. By the time an investigative team headed by a noted biophysicist reached out to Heflin at the end of September, Marine Corps intelligence officers had come to Heflin's house, interviewed him, and borrowed the first 3 pictures to make copies. The photographs were returned, after which the US Air Force also made contact and conducted an official inquiry, during which Heflin was interviewed for more than 3 hours, and the originals were once again taken away for further investigation. As before, the images were returned, with the report made by the US Air Force being sent to Project Blue Book. Despite the generally positive report, which concluded that Heflin was not attempting to perpetrate a hoax, Project Blue Book labelled the images as precisely that: hoaxes. Even so, there was still great interest in Heflin's photographs. According to Heflin's testimony, on the 20th of September, a man claiming to be a NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command colonel, phoned him and arranged to meet him 2 days later. During the call, the man warned Heflin not to discuss the event further with the press. By this point, Heflin was growing used to the government wanting to look at his images and thought that this was a routine follow-up to him having inadvertently photographed an experimental and therefore secret aircraft. As such, on the evening of the 22nd, 2 men arrived at Heflin's house, claiming to be from NORAD. Peculiarly, they were said to have been dressed in civilian clothing, in simple, dark business suits. Even so, one of the men supposedly produced a folder filled with various papers, including an ID card, which, according to Heflin, looked similar to those carried by El Toro Marines. Heflin did not remember the name on the ID, but noted that, strangely, it did not have a photo. The other man is said to have been silent and did not interact with Heflin for the entirety of the visit. By the time they left, the men had the original Polaroids in their possession. Heflin did not request a receipt. After having dealt with Marine Corps intelligence and the Air Force, he had no reason to believe he would not see the images again. As it was, they were not returned. When Heflin later contacted NORAD to query the non-return of his images, the Chief of Staff sent a written response stating that NORAD does not have the responsibility for evaluation of UFOs, and therefore would not knowingly be in the business of collecting UFO pictures for evaluation. In other words, NORAD denied having been in contact with Heflin and told him that it was not possible for their agents to have taken his photographs. Heflin was perplexed. What had happened to his photos, and who were the mysterious men in suits who had taken them? To make matters even more unsettling, some 2 years later, on the evening of the 11th of October 1967, Heflin claimed to have had a second strange encounter when a man in a US Air Force uniform, identifying himself as Captain C.H. Edmonds, turned up at his house. Like the so-called NORAD agents from 2 years earlier, the ID card the man presented had no photograph. Not only that, as Heflin spoke with him on his front porch, he noticed that, about 30 feet away, parked at the curb, the car which the man had arrived in was emanating a strange purplish glow. The vehicle was described as having been a dark blue 1965 or 1966 Chevy with dark lettering, which Heflin was unable to read on the door. As he watched the car, Heflin claimed he saw movement in the back seat, as if a second person was watching him as he spoke with the so-called captain. Heflin reported that his conversation with the captain was peculiar, with the man asking him if he had ever heard of the Bermuda Triangle, as well as pressuring him to answer personal questions. Throughout, Heflin felt uncomfortable and later speculated that he may have been filmed by the person concealed in the back of the vehicle. After the captain left, the strangeness is said to have continued, with it seeming as though Heflin's telephone had been tapped, and his neighbour telling him that she had seen Marine Corps and Air Force officers nosing around his home whilst he was at work. Angry at his privacy being so invaded, Heflin reported these intrusions to the Air Force. They denied all involvement and even filed a memo regarding the impersonation of Air Force officers. There was no record of a Captain C.H. Edmonds ever having gone to Heflin's house. In the decades since, no one has been able to confirm who the strange men in suits were, or where they had come from. Neither has it been possible to determine what Heflin saw that day over Santa Ana Freeway. Despite various claims that his images are fraudulent, many researchers stand by them as genuine UFO evidence, with many individuals and publications continuing to regard them as among the best UFO photos ever taken. And yet, this was not the end of this strange saga. One day in 1993, Heflin, by now suffering from serious health conditions and living elsewhere, received a phone call from an unknown woman. She simply asked him, "Have you checked your mailbox lately?" Before he could answer, the woman hung up. When he went to his mailbox, Heflin found a plain manila envelope with no postage marks. Inside were his original Polaroid photographs. For whatever reason, and after almost 3 decades, they had finally been returned. In April 2008, Raven Mendel, a renowned cryptozoologist, writer, and radio host, claims to have had her life besieged by the men in black. She states that strange things began to happen to her when she started to research UFOs in a more serious manner. It is all said to have begun on the 16th of April 2008 at around 5:30 p.m. when two men dressed in all black walked out of an apartment that was across from the one in which she was living with her husband at the time. She stated that no one was living in that apartment, and so the men were unexpected. Outside, she watched the two men walk from the apartment towards a black Lincoln parked on the curb. As they walked past Mendel, they are said to have stared at her with stone-cold, emotionless faces. Understandably, this aroused her suspicions, and she began to move towards the Lincoln they had just entered to get a better look at their license plate. As she did, however, the men allegedly backed out real quick and took off. Mendel believes that it was a deliberate maneuver on their part and that her interest in them had spooked them. With this ominous interaction, a dark cloud supposedly descended upon her and her family's lives. Phone calls with no one on the other end began to be repeatedly made to their home. Whispered voices could be heard echoing through their apartment, as well as other sinister, poltergeist-like activity. On one occasion, she claims to have found strange, huge handprints on her bathroom mirror, even discovering bruises on her daughter when she got out of the shower that matched those handprints. And the terror was not only confined to her apartment, it followed her outside. During a walk with her dog, Mendel claims that a black Cadillac followed her and drove right alongside her. She stated that there was an older man driving with a younger man in the passenger seat, watching her as she walked. They even stopped, only a foot away from her, as if to let her know that they were watching her. After these experiences, fear dominated her waking life, and even extended into sleep, with Mendel reporting night terrors. During one particularly horrible night, she documented how she felt like her whole body was being crushed in her sleep, as a loud noise hummed in her ear. This state of affairs continued until she moved away from UFO research. "It scared me from going into it any deeper," she claimed. "I got the message, and I'm not going to mess with the UFO thing anymore." For Mendel, the terrifying incident changed her life. "The fear," she has stated, "is still with me." Jan-Ove Sundberg was a famous Swedish freelance journalist known for exploring cryptozoological creatures around the world. A self-styled monster hunter, he wrote about mysterious sea creatures extensively, organised dozens of voyages to find them, and was featured in many documentaries during his career. When he died in 2011, he donated all his research materials to the Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden. Among the materials is a personal encounter he documented early in his career in 1971 at Loch Ness, Scotland. On the 14th of August 1971, Sundberg was walking through a woodland near Foyers Bay at Loch Ness when he supposedly came across a strange craft in a clearing. Sundberg describes the craft as being dark grey, around 30 feet in length, cigar-shaped and with a large section on top of it which reminded him of a handle. Whilst observing the craft, Sundberg was shocked to see three beings step into the clearing and approach the craft. Described as grey with diving suits, Sundberg at first thought that they were humans exploring the nearby loch. However, when they entered the craft through a panel and quickly took off horizontally and without making a noise, Sundberg dismissed any notions of their earthly origins. Even though he had a camera on him, Sundberg was not able to take a clear picture. He described how a certain paralysis came over him as he witnessed what appeared to be aliens. Sundberg did manage to take one photograph as the craft took off, but upon analysis by a Scandinavian UFO group, it was deemed unidentified. The photograph's last known whereabouts are with researcher Dr. James Harder, whom Sundberg sent the photo to so as to be analysed further. The story, however, does not end there. Indeed, it may be the beginning of a defining moment in Sundberg's life. After he arrived back home in Sweden, he supposedly began to be plagued by what he believed were men in black. Strange footprints were spotted around his garden, suggesting someone had been investigating his property. He received odd phone calls from what can only be described as peculiar entities, and poltergeist phenomena inundated his house. It is even alleged that the men in black drove Sundberg to have a nervous breakdown. Stanislav Moskalenko was an experienced Soviet fighter pilot who served in Central Asia in the 1980s. His job was to secure the borders against neighbouring air forces making sorties into Soviet territory, which at the time happened frequently. One day, Moskalenko was sent out in a supersonic fighter plane to ward off what was then thought to be a routine intrusion. However, it soon became apparent that the craft he was pursuing was strange, when it was revealed by another aircraft sent ahead that they could not see it visually or on radar. The forwarding aircraft was ordered back to base, but before Moskalenko received the same order, a ground control tower reported that they could now see the target. Yet, Moskalenko could not. Even so, Control ordered that he maintain a heading towards where the target was appearing on radar. He understood this to mean that he should proceed to ram the mysterious craft. And yet, how could he do so without being able to see it? Upon piercing the air where the object was supposed to be, a light fog is said to have encapsulated the canopy of his fighter plane for a split second. Immediately, Control shouted to Moskalenko that the object was right below him. With a sharp turn, he pointed the plane downward to the ground. There was nothing. Then he noticed a craft moving near the ground, left to right. The controller, Captain Oleg Kazunin, reported that at that moment the blip on the radar turned into a large dot, and then moved quickly towards the radar scope's upper rim and away. According to Kazunin, the object was leaving the zone quicker than a missile. During all of this, Moskalenko's sight had become hazy, and he claimed to have experienced strange visions of fires and blurring masks. When his senses returned, he immediately leveled the plane and reported that no object had been detected. To his surprise, he had not been descending in inverted flight, as he last remembered, but had been ascending. For 3 days afterwards, the regiment flew hundreds of sorties in an effort to chase this ghostly target, to no avail. They even sent a request to Moscow to test secret equipment against it. Nothing worked, and eventually they gave up. However, the story did not end there for Moskalenko. In 1990, he was discussing this incident with his friend, Major Oleg Belomestinov, when something both bizarre and terrifying is said to have happened. Mid-conversation, the Major witnessed his friend receive a sudden, powerful blow in the back that knocked him to the ground. After this, Moskalenko supposedly soared, his body horizontal up into the air, only for a few feet before coming crashing down. Belomestinov helped him back up and, in a state of shock, started to help him walk home. Hazy and unsteady, confused by what was happening, Moskalenko alleged to have seen blurry visions of strange landscapes as they walked. Then, even stranger, a short, lean and unkempt man in black is said to have stopped them both. Appearing from nowhere and seen by both men, he is stated to have warned Moskalenko that there may yet be another energized strike against him. The man in black is claimed to have been telepathically communicating with him, ignoring Belomestinov even as he shouted at him. The strange man is said to have then approached Moskalenko and touched his swollen leg with the palm of his hand. After a sudden, intense heat, the pain dissipated, alongside the strange visions, after which the man mysteriously disappeared. Even though Major Belomestinov never believed in UFOs, he is claimed to have confirmed the story when it was afterwards reported to the authorities. He and Moskalenko had both seen the man in black. The strange man in black's identity, however, as well as his connection to the ghost UFO, has never been uncovered. Jenny Randalls is a former Director of Investigations with the British UFO Research Association and a well-regarded author on all manner of paranormal phenomena. With over 50 books published on subjects as diverse as crop circles, time slips, ESP, and life after death, it could be said that Randalls has a high tolerance for the strange. And yet, when writing about the Men in Black phenomenon in 1997, there was one case which baffled even her. Describing the incident as the strangest MIB case, indeed just about the strangest case of any type she had ever been involved in, Randalls was left unable to explain the incident, and even after extensive personal research, was only able to conclude it was extraordinary. For Randalls, the story began on the 4th of December 1987, when she received a letter from a man who claimed to be a former police officer. The man wrote to Randalls requesting her help regarding a strange encounter he claimed to have had some 3 days earlier, on the 1st of December, whilst walking over Ilkley Moor in Yorkshire, England. It was about 7:45 AM, and he had been going to visit a relative when he decided to take some photos of the landscape en route. It should have been a perfectly ordinary outing, and yet, when approaching the village of East Morton, the man told Randalls he saw something peculiar, an unusual figure on the rocks, dark green and with a large head. According to his letter, the figure appeared to gesture to him, and so, camera in hand, the man quickly photographed the strange green figure, then watched it scuttle away around a rock formation. The man hurried after it, and was just in time to see a disc-like object. Stunned, he watched it shoot into the sky, the camera in his hand forgotten. Abandoning his plans to visit his family, the man hurried back to civilization, only to discover that the time was different from what he had expected. The clock on the church showed it to be 10 AM. He had been walking about 7:45, and there was no way that over 2 hours had passed. Unnerved, he took the bus to a nearby market town to get his film developed. Shockingly, the picture of the strange figure came out. Randalls wrote that she was initially impressed by the letter, the man who requested to keep his identity protected and asked that Randalls refer to him by the pseudonym Philip Spencer, came across as a rationalist, despite the strangeness of his story. According to Randalls, he seemed utterly disinterested in publicity or making money from his photograph, despite knowing how newspapers would pay to publish his image. He was instead more concerned with the preservation of his reputation. He was a former police officer and did not wish to damage his career prospects. Randalls was quick to respond to Spencer's letter, stressing to him the importance of proper testing of the photographic evidence. She did not receive a reply to her letter, and it seemed as though the case was cold. Then, a few weeks later, Randalls discovered that Spencer had contacted another researcher and was thus able to speak with Spencer directly over the phone. At this point, Randalls' interest in the case grew. Aside from the photograph and the story itself, there was something peculiar about the witness. When Randalls was eventually able to speak with Spencer over the phone, and later to meet with him in person, she was struck by how remarkably laid back he was. He, according to Randalls, lacked the sort of emotional tie to the case that one ought to expect of someone who had secured such dramatic evidence. In a word, he came across as disinterested, even though he had been the one to request help from the UFO researchers. Analysis of the photograph confirmed that it was not trick photography, but a real object on the moors. What that real object was, of course, was impossible to ascertain. Feedback from a professional wildlife photographer who Randalls and fellow researcher Peter Huff contacted suggested that there was indeed a small greenish entity with a large head standing on the rocks, but that the image was too fuzzy to confirm whether it was a living creature or a model or doll. Eventually, Randalls came to the conclusion that the case must have been a hoax. An encounter with a little green man seemed too convenient, too fanciful, too bogus to be true. And yet, what were Spencer's motives for fraud? His disinterest in what Randalls described as the photographic scoop of the century was impossible to ignore. With no desire for fame or fortune, Spencer simply stuck to his story. It was what it was, and he wasn't overly excited about it. As Randalls and Huff continued to investigate the photograph, the case became stranger still. In March 1988, several months after the original incident, Spencer agreed to meet with a clinical psychologist. Under hypnosis, Spencer revealed something he had not before, a missing memory, in which he had been abducted by the green creature he had seen on the moors. According to a transcript of the hypnosis session, Spencer became increasingly more agitated as he relived the experience and described being stuck, with everything going fuzzy as the creature came towards him. An especially disturbing extract from Spencer's hypnosis session is as follows. "I'm floating along in the air. I want to get down. I still can't get down and I don't like it. I'm going around this corner and this green thing is in front of me. Oh God, I want to get down. There's a big silver saucer thing, there's a door in it, and I don't want to go in there." Spencer also described being shown 2 films by the aliens whilst on board their ship. The first film supposedly contained lots of scenes of destruction, including starving people and waste going into rivers. Sinisterly, when the psychologist asked him what was on the second film, Spencer replied by saying he was not supposed to speak about it. When pressed to reveal details, he said, "I'm not supposed to tell anyone about the other film. It's not for them to know." Peter Huff's transcript of the session described how Spencer's breathing became faster as he spoke, and how his voice sounded worried and afraid as he detailed his entrance into the big silver saucer. Undeniably, it is disturbing to contemplate a normally laid-back individual expressing such emotion whilst discussing what can only be described as a terrifying abduction experience. The psychologist who facilitated the session was also impressed, and was certain that Spencer was describing an experience that he believed had really happened. Not only that, the missing memory seemed to explain the loss of time Spencer initially reported. In many ways, it would be easy to ridicule this case. There are many alien tropes: green spacemen, silver flying saucers. Even the abduction of an unconcerned Yorkshireman strolling across the moors sounds cartoonish. And yet, it was not so ridiculous to escape the attention of the men in black. According to Randalls, on the 15th of January 1988, while Spencer's photograph was out of town being examined by the wildlife photographer, Spencer phoned Peter Huff late at night, upset, claiming that he and his wife had just been visited by two men claiming to be from the Ministry of Defence. They had arrived at 8:30 p.m. and had stayed at his house for 50 minutes. The men both appeared to be in their early 40s, wore smart business suits and produced photo ID cards that bore the MOD symbol. One of the men, who claimed to be called David Jefferson, did all the talking, whilst the other, whose surname was Davis, remained silent. They claimed they had come to interview Spencer about his sighting, without revealing how they knew about it. Spencer's case was not publicly known. Only Randall and 3 others knew the details, and more importantly, Spencer's real identity. In Randall's own words, there had been no publicity whatsoever for the case, and the MOD simply could not have then known about it through any normal means. Not only was the agents' appearance strange, but also their behaviour. According to Spencer, they seemed perplexed by the electric fire in the room, and wanted to know how it worked, asking him many questions about it. Eventually returning to Spencer's sighting, the man in the suit called Jefferson asked Spencer if they could have the negative of his photograph. Spencer was stunned. He had not told them about the photo, and yet they seemed to know about its existence anyway. When he told them that he did not have it, and that it was with a friend, the men in suits simply got up and left, not stopping to ask who the friend was. Spencer was by this point unsettled. Who were these people? How did they know about his sighting? Keeping his identity a secret had been his priority from the start, and so he was all the more upset the next morning when, at 8:55 a.m, he supposedly received a phone call from the Mirror Group newspapers. The caller claimed that they knew Spencer's real name and address and were going to publish his story. Terrified that it was all getting out of control, and suspecting that Randalls and Huff were responsible for the leak, Spencer phoned Huff again, demanding his negative be returned and the investigation ended. Randall, shocked and trying to figure out what was going on, immediately phoned both the London and Manchester offices of the Mirror Group newspapers. Careful about the information that she gave them, she simply referred to Spencer's case as the story regarding a UFO photograph. Despite her phoning within an hour of their alleged call to Spencer, no one at either office knew anything about the story. With the journalist's interest piqued, Randalls quickly hung up and relayed the information to Spencer. It seemed that whoever had phoned him had not been the newspaper, but was instead someone trying to intimidate him into ceasing research into his sighting by playing on his deepest fear, publicity, and the damage it would subsequently cause his reputation. What was going on? After much prodding and several written requests, Peter Huff was able to get a response from the MOD, who admitted in writing that they did not send anyone around to see the witness that day. They would not, however, confirm or deny the existence of intelligence officers with the names Jefferson and Davis. Equally, the unit which wrote to Huff was unable to claim that no element of the British government might be able to send people around to speak with a UFO witness, only that they did not. As for Spencer, at the time of Randall's writing some 10 years after the original incident, he still asserted the truth of his encounter. The green figure had been real, as were the men in black who had pursued and intimidated him in the aftermath. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. Equally, you can sign up to my email newsletter via paranormalscholar.com to receive notifications of all new content. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time,